Let me start off by saying that I am a larger 15-year-old male with two brothers who we'll call Will and Scott. Will is my twin brother, while Scott is our older 17-year-old brother. We live in a very safe, small mountain town by the name of Boone, here in North Carolina, where we attend a local high school. Before I get too deep into the story, I like to give a little background information. I've lived in Boone my entire life. Having moved here once my brother Will and I were born, there are many other kids our age here, and at the end of the street live Mr. and Mrs. Phillips. Mrs. Phillips always loved joking around and playing with the children of the neighborhood. I believe she did this as their own children died in a drunk driving accident. Sadly, last year, Mrs. Phillips died, and it shook our community as she was a very well-respected member of our neighborhood, who everyone loved and very dearly enjoyed. Mr. Phillips, on the other hand, was a lot rowdier. It always seemed to have something to complain about. That being said, he was always nice to me, and he'd always say it reminded him of his dead son Andrew. This always made me feel somewhat sad, and after Mrs. Phillips' death, Mr. Phillips went somewhat crazy. One December morning, I decided I would brave the cold and skip on riding with my brothers so I could sit next to a girl I liked on the bus. I began my 5 to 10 minute walk to the bus stop when I noticed Mr. Phillips' truck idling in his driveway. Most of the vehicles in the neighborhood were doing the same, so I thought nothing of it and continued my trek at the bottom of the street. On the way down, I noticed a dog in the window, and being the immature teen I was at the time, I decided to shout loudly, which of course got the dog all riled up and barking. Suddenly, I heard a very loud engine roar to life. Looking back, I noticed Mr. Phillips' truck going about 35 miles above the speed limit, heading straight for me with no signs of going around me. When his truck got about 10 feet away from me, I dove for the ditch, at which point I looked back to see if Mr. Phillips was going to slow down or check if I was okay. He didn't. Instead, he was cackling like a madman and yelling out of his truck window that I need to pay attention to where I'm walking next time, or he will hit me. I was shocked at Mr. Phillips' actions, but I decided not to tell my parents about what had happened, both to avoid trouble and because I knew my dad would probably kick his ass and didn't want him to get hurt or any sort of legal trouble. As time went on, we saw less and less of Mr. Phillips, who mostly stayed in his home and drank whiskey. If Mr. Phillips needed something, his nephew Jake would get it for him. In some ways, I felt happy as I knew if he was inside, Mr. Phillips wouldn't be a dick to everyone in town. Yet, some part of me also felt sadness, like this guy I'd grown up knowing used to do things like give us $5 bills just because he felt like it, and would sometimes hold dodgeball games with the kids in the neighborhood. Now he'd become a husk of his former self, only bitter and angry. I say all of this because he soon began complaining about my older Walker coonhound named Jack, that I had had since I was 4. Jack would go out to pee in the mornings, and sometimes he'd wander in Mr. Phillips' yard, scratching around, looking for scraps around his barbecue pit. Almost every other day, Mr. Phillips would now come pounding on my door, telling me to get my dog out of his yard. Because of this, I began letting Jack out less and less until one summer morning, feeling tired, I let him out to do his business anyways, before going back to bed, wanting to hear him bark to come back in. After 2 hours of not hearing Jack, my brother and I went outside and looked for him. We thought that maybe he was snagged a deer or something, but at his age, it was getting quite hard to do. Our worry began to grow when we called his name all up and down the street but never get a response. Out of options, we eventually went home and called my close friend Ryan. Soon after, we used Ryan's truck to slowly go up and down the street looking for our dog Jack. When we approached Mr. Phillips' house, I was just going to ignore him, but he waved at us before smiling. "If you want something done correctly, do it yourself." Confused, I asked him if he had seen our dog Jack, to which he responded in an almost laughing voice, "I think I saw him in your backyard." Relieved we finally knew where he was, my brother headed back to our home before approaching the backyard. To our shock and horror, we found our 11-year-old best friend Jack hanging from a tree and clearly dead. I fell to my knees in tears, not wanting to believe what I was seeing. My sweet dog had been murdered. I felt my older brother grab my arm and tell me we need to go inside to call 911. Dragging me inside, we did just that. and when the police arrived, they cut down Jack and offered to take him in. But I told them no, and I let them know we could bury him. When we finally were questioned, I told them about Mr. Phillips, and I was sure he had killed my dog. They soon headed over to that bastard's house where he was still smiling, before talking to him for about 15 minutes and returning, telling us they didn't have sufficient evidence that he was the one who killed our dog, so they couldn't arrest him. By this time, my mother was home early from the situation and raising hell that they need to arrest him. Sadly, they never did. The old son of a bitch got away with murdering my dog and almost running me over, though I never told anyone about that. I eventually decided if the law wasn't going to give me justice, then I would do it myself. One day, I took my lacrosse stick and a bucket of balls out of 50 yards up the hill where Mr. Phillips lived. I soon began launching the balls at his home, breaking 2 windows before he finally came out to confront me. Mr. Williams told me to stop, at which point I threw him in the middle finger and tried launching a ball at his chest. It hit him in the thigh, and he fell over before I decided to run. Locking my doors at home, I realized after the fact what I did was probably a bad idea. A week later, Mr. Phillips' windows were fixed. One day, I was just about to doze off, but I woke to the sound of my window shutting. I was terrified and didn't look, but I knew it was likely Mr. Phillips. I felt my bed sink and a knife was pressed against my cap before I heard Mr. Phillips whispering, "It would be a shame if a big, strong lacrosse player like you had his calf cut wide open, wouldn't it?" I screamed for my dad, and Mr. Phillips escaped out the window, leaving it open. My parents believed my story and called the cops, who came over, but after questioning Mr. Phillips, they claimed they had no evidence it had happened, so they still couldn't do anything. Mr. Phillips was once again let go, with no charges against him. My parents eventually installed cameras and filed a restraining order against him, but every couple of days I'd hear him outside singing his old war songs, and on one occasion, Beastie Boys would scare me even more. Finally, he came to the backyard one night with a bottle of booze and began singing something that sounded like this. "My time is up and you have won. My life is dead and nobody cares. Go to hell, go to hell. Gonna end it all, gonna end it all." My dad and I watched him and even began to chuckle at one point, because he was so crazy. Mr. Phillips wasn't a liar, however, because the next day on his wife's birthday, he shot himself on her gravesite.
This is a story about a culmination of events that happened over the course of a decade, or almost a decade, from when I was a small child to the present day. It's probably one of the most unnerving things that's happened to me, and I'm going to share it with you. It started after we moved to the country outside of Afton, Oklahoma. Afton is a very small town that is barely big enough to be on the weather map. It's mostly a residential area for Grove, Miami, and Vinita, as there are very few places an Afton resident can work. My father moved out there to the country by my grandmother, down the road actually. It was out in the middle of nowhere. I lived most of the year with my mother and stepfather, but during the summer and every other weekend, I'd spend it, or most of it, with my biological father. The house was on a hill, as was our neighbors and my grandparents up the road. You'd go up this huge hill, then you drive by my grandparents, and further down the road, you'd drive on a ridge, and there's a split to go to our neighbors or go down the ridge to our house. It may not seem important, but I'll have an explanation later. The area was by a creek called Horse Creek. Horse Creek had a legend surrounding it, that a tribe of Indians was living on that land in the mid-1800s. The Union wanted to take the small snippets of land on the border of Indian Territory, so they sectioned off a bit and went in to find it inhabited by Creek Indians. So they decided to kill them all. They sent cavalry to secure the village and force the warriors upstream. They positioned riflemen to pick them off one by one. They shot them in the creek like animals, and the horses continued to run upstream until the waters rose too high and they drowned trying to escape. I will post another time with my experience with that. But back to this one. When I was little, I remember seeing a very tall man or shadow of a man in the woods by the house. Whenever I would look at it, it would hide behind a tree. This went on for a few years. I got older, and I'd hear whispers sometimes that would pierce the air. I always brushed it off as me hearing things. As I continued to get older, things started to quiet down just a bit. but they started to pick up again after one night. It was a weekend, and my father came in at night and told me to stay inside because he saw a tall man outside. So he grabbed his gun and the dogs, and he went outside to confront this man. There was a singular power light outside, and when my father got out there was nothing. Things picked up from that. Relatively shortly after, my father was sitting outside at night, and our dogs perked up their ears. They turned to the barbed wire fence and started growling deeply and viciously. At the time, we had a basset hound, and we still have 2 dachshunds. The basset, Sophie, was a sweetheart and never growled at anything, and they growled at the darkness like they hated it with their very being. My father went inside to get his gun, and whatever it was gone by the time he returned. My father eventually took up a job at a wellness center 30 minutes away and left me alone for most, if not all, of the morning. One day we looked out of our bathroom window that overlooked the pasture down at the bottom of the ridge, and we saw a coyote. That's why my father had called me in. But it walked wrong. It stumbled, but kept a steady pace, stumbling but not slowing at all. And it was the middle of the day. Most coyotes come out at night to hunt, but not this one. We took out a pair of binoculars and looked at it. Then it, and I kid you not, started galloping into the trees like some kind of horse. A few times I heard my father calling me. But the problem with this was that he was at his job, half an hour away. And his voice just didn't sound right. It was too resonant, like he was yelling through a tube. Sometimes I'd be outside, and I'd hear 3 sharp whistles, but I'd always assumed it was birds. There were lots of birds, but doing some digging, there were no birds there that could have made that noise. Sometimes I'd hear this terrifying screech out from the hills. It pierced the air and felt like a knife on my eardrum. I always thought it was some kind of animal, but again, no animal could have made that noise. We'd go camping occasionally by the creek, and we'd feel watched, or I'd feel watched. One night, I went to relieve myself at the edge of the woods by the clearing. I finished, but I heard a branch snap nearby. Only 2 things snap branches: large animals and people. I saw no deer, and all of the cows were about a mile away from us. I heard some thud, 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 like footsteps, heavy footsteps. I quickly went down back to the campsite. Here's the pinnacle. One night a few years ago, we were driving home, and it was a clear night. The sun had set an hour previous. Then, as we were driving down the road, a fog swept across the road. This confused me. Then something dashed across. It had to have been 7 feet tall, and it had spines running up and down its back. Its limbs were slender and were bone-thin. It had large hands and long claws. It had long legs and large feet, and it had a slouched position. When the headlights hit it, it took 2 strides to get across the road, and a third to bound over the ditch and barbed wire fence on the other side. I shouted, "Whoa!" and my father just saw a blur. I was silent for the rest of the drive home. The next day, after my father left, I went outside to see the dogs, and there was a tall figure standing at our mailbox up at the top of the hill. I thought I was seeing things. After a few hours, it finally went away. And a few hours later, or the next day, we were coming back from something and checked the mailbox. Some of the dirt around it was misplaced. I didn't notice it until I remembered. I didn't notice it because it was so big. It was a handprint. That thing's handprint.
This happened back when I was 12 or 13 years old. Now, a little backstory here. My dad and I volunteered at a bird banding station. If you don't know what bird banding is, it is where researchers put small metal bands on the legs of birds and then release them to track their migration patterns. We set out mist nets in the woods to catch the birds. We used nets instead of traditional traps so we wouldn't harm the birds. So anyway, the guy who owned the bird banding station in the entire property, let's call him R, would let me wander the woods. While he was collecting birds out of the nets, R's property was massive, with woods, countryside, marshland, and you name it, all out here on the edge of a small town. Now back to the story. It was a cool summer morning. I was wandering in my usual part of the forest. It wasn't long before I noticed that it was unusually silent, which was odd. I usually hear at least one thrush or blue jay, but there was nothing. All of a sudden, in the distance, I hear what sounds like a distressed baby deer or a cat. Being the curious animal lover I was, I followed the noise. However, as I got closer to the sound, it seemed to grow a lot farther away. It wasn't long before I came to the edge of our property. The wailing sounded like it was coming from nearby 1 minute, and then sounding very far away the next. Despite being confused and a little creeped out, I for some reason so followed it. However, a few minutes later, I came across a small deer blind. I looked inside to see if anyone was messing with me, but there was nobody there. When I got a better look at the blind, I noticed something a bit off. There were massive slashes on the sides. They looked as if a person had slashed them with a knife, or an animal's claw marks. But there were no bears in this part of Michigan. Odd. So being a curious 13-year-old, I continued on my way to finding this distressed animal. I was walking along the edge of ours woods, trying not to go too far. I'm starting to get frustrated. Where the heck was this scream coming from? So being the naive little girl I was, I mimicked the noise that I was hearing to try to find my way back to the animal, to see if it would show herself. Not a minute passes by and I hear a noise that I will never forget. It sounded like a dog's growl, mixed with a buck's grunt. No deer sounded like this though. Something in my brain told me to get the heck out of there, and I did, leaping over twigs and branches until I'm in R's front yard. As I'm making my way towards his house, I hear the same sound, growling, coming from the woods, about 10 meters behind me at the very least. So instead, I run towards the research sack. Since R wasn't at the house and the doors would most likely be locked, I knew that no one would believe me. So I just said that a deer growled at me. However, I've heard deer grunts and snorts all my life, and they do not even compare to the animal that I heard. It didn't sound like a coyote or a dog either. Although, I never saw the thing. I believe that it was trying to get me off the property to do who knows what. I'm guessing that it might have been a Wendigo, since they can mimic noises of other animals and even voices. I also live near the Great Lakes, a hot spot for Wendigo sightings, maybe even a skinwalker, but they tend to be more in the western states. So, whenever you're in the woods and something doesn't seem right, don't just brush it off.
My mother married a highly successful businessman in 1988. This man was from a prominent local family who owned a funeral parlor. The businessman owned a painting franchise retail store and an interior design company. He also was a master carpenter who eventually opened his own Civil War reproduction artillery shop, where he would build antique cannons for the National Park Service, as well as for individual investors. Needless to say, the man was entranced with history, and he would often visit Colonial Williamsburg, which led him to build several homes in our Kentucky city that were patterned after historical buildings and plantation homes, inspired by his visits to the Virginia colony. This leads me to my story. It was October of 1992 when my parents, having recently finished building an impressive 3-story plantation home on the outskirts of town, decided to buy a piece of property downtown in an antiquated suburb. Surrounded by mansions and structures that had been a part of the city for well over 100 years, this area of town came complete with an old stone church and was within walking distance of our famous Central Park. The property my parents bought was small, but the house was massive, sitting at almost 6,000 square feet, with 3 levels and a basement on it, which were curiously divided into 4 apartments. The current owner, a local minister, had segmented the house in such a manner that he lived alone on the first floor. The second floor housed 3 individual apartments, with a back staircase for access that was completely separated for his living space on the first floor. The third floor was completely empty, having previously been a ballroom of the original occupants before being destroyed by a fire in 1922, and never being reclaimed afterward. At this point in time, I was a 16-year-old, an honor student, and I was completely clean and sober. I even used to lecture people about the dangers of drinking and smoking, which was ironic, as I'm 42 now, and I'm no stranger to drugs and alcohol. At the time, however, I was a party virgin, so I wasn't under the influence of anything but self-preservation. Now, my story can truly begin. As a 16-year-old male, I had constant heat with my stepfather. We gritted against one another from time to time. When I found out about the recent property purchase, I knew they weren't going to move in until they had it good enough condition to move the entire family in. 5 of us, including 2 dogs and a cat. Knowing this, and wanting some peace and quiet, I asked my family if I could move into one of the apartments to get some peace and quiet from the family. Much to my surprise, they agreed. So a couple buddies and I moved all my shit out of the house and into the new apartment as quickly as possible before my family could change their minds. I'd never taken the time to check the apartment out, so when we arrived with the key and our stuff, I was completely overwhelmed. The house was massive. It was totally gothic. Stone pillars, black iron fence, stained glass windows, 2 staircases, 4 outside entrance points, and a painted blood red. I was quite surprised my stepfather had bought the place, as it wasn't the least bit colonial, and it didn't resemble the southern plantation homes I was used to. I was and still am big into horror movies, so being able to live in a house like this, by myself for at least a few months, was the coolest thing ever. My enthusiasm was hindered only by one thing. The only working phone line was in the basement. Soon after moving all my stuff into my second floor dwelling and my buddies departing, I tried to settle into my new surroundings. Old hardwood floors, chipped paint, faulty lighting, and the coming of sundown brought me new fear. The realization had hit me that I was going to be alone in this colossal rundown mansion with bad pipes, bad lights, and since cell phones were not a thing yet, no way of communicating with anyone. Trying not to think too much on this, I took the skeleton key and locked all the doors before reading the subway for a BLT. Upon returning and letting myself in, all the doors were standing ajar by an inch. Nervous, I made my way to the apartment with what little light was available as the light in the hallway was now off. Locking myself in my new abode, I began eating my sandwich. Eventually, I headed back out with the flashlight and my skeleton key and relocked all the doors once again. I always felt really isolated in the house, and yet I could never shake this feeling of being watched. I soon headed back to my apartment, hooking up my stereo and a DVD player before watching a movie. About a half hour into the film, I heard someone coming up the stairs, so I paused the movie. Nothing. I waited, listened intently for another few minutes, but still there was nothing. Feeling a little paranoid, I took my flashlight and key and made my way to the upper corridor. Once again, I found every door unlocked and opened an inch. Feeling that I needed to back up, I locked my apartment and left. I headed to my best friend's workplace, Blockbuster, before telling him what was going on. He informed me his shift ended at 11 and he'd come over to my place then. After his shift, he headed back to my apartment and locked ourselves inside. At about 12:30 a.m., I heard the sound of someone coming up the stairs again. This was soon followed by an unbearable silence. Dusty got up and armed himself with an American cavalry sword. I realized how stupid this sounds, before we both made our way into the upper hall. Once again, every door was ajar by an inch. We decided to make a clean sweep of the entire house except for the basement, locking every door behind us as we did. At about 1 a.m., we finished our sweep and returned to my room again. For the remainder of the night, we'd hear footsteps and neither of us could sleep. Checking things again in the morning, we saw all the doors unlocked and opened by an inch. Now comes the scary part. Later that day after school, I went back to eat dinner with my family at their house. During our meal, my mother asked how my night went. Trying not to sound much like a coward, I told my family I loved the place, especially the peace and quiet from my other siblings, and my overbearing stepfather. My mom soon gave me a puzzled look. "You didn't sound too good over the phone," she said. "What are you talking about?" I asked. She then said, "I called you last night and you sounded odd." I asked her what she meant, and informed her I never went to the basement, nor did I hear the phone ringing at all last night. My mother then informed me not to scare my little brothers like that. To this day, she still swears she spoke to me on the phone at night. I never answered the phone. Dusty never answered the phone. Neither of us heard the phone at all that night. I'm not sure what happened, but one thing is clear. Something answered the phone that night and it wasn't us.
It was summer of 2018, and like many others, I went on vacation to a place somewhat isolated from people, just to get away. I had gone with my two cousins to a ranch we own in Lake Perris, California. For reference, I will call one M and the older one J. M being the same age as me at 24, and J at 28. I had been planning to go visit them for almost 3 years, but I hadn't gotten the chance, due to transportation and always having to work. I only had just gotten the chance to be able to travel because I had crashed my brand new Ninja motorcycle in September of 2017, breaking my collarbone and 3 of my ribs, rendering me unable to work. While recovering, I was living in the Bay Area by San Francisco, and to think I wanted to ride 8 to 10 hours out to my family's ranch on a bike, that would have been suicide, since I'm not at all familiar with the roads. Anyways, I had finally gone to visit, and I thought it was going to take much of my stress away. In many ways, it did. But during my time there, it seemed like things just started to get worse. Not only did my girl dump me, but strange things started happening again, like my uncle's mom passing away, and along with my cousin M that was sitting next to me at the time, seeing her spirit late one night at around 2 a.m. We both started to see weird things. We both turned to each other one night to see something peeking into the room at the same time, and I asked him, "But did you see that?" I stood up to see if it was my other cousin trying to creep us out. When I walked out the door, I saw my great-aunt's face and top torso turning and fading away into the thin air. I automatically ran into the room on my tippy toes and both hands on my chest, repeating what I saw to her over and over again. Well, 2 days after, in between everything that was happening at the time, me and my cousin Jay decided to go smoke a bowl under the large evergreen tree in the back, by where all the cow, chickens, and goats are kept, with the intention of avoiding my aunts and uncles smelling what we were up to, out of respect. So, it was a bright sunny day. I and Jay, along with our huge all-black 200-pound Great Dane Abigail, was just chilling on a wooden bench under the evergreen, staring out to some of the hills, where there were no more or 2 or 3 miles away. I noticed a large black horse, pacing side to side in the middle of the 2 biggest hills, behind what looked like a barbed wire fence that ran along the top of the hills, pairing the sides of the old abandoned building that looked like it was used to be a slaughterhouse. Really thinking nothing of it, I looked at the dog laying in front of us, whose head and ears were both aiming straight up at the black figure, high up between the hills. When I realized just how long that thing had been there, I had seen it come up from the hills about 15 or 20 minutes earlier, and Abigail had not taken her eyes off of it the entire time. So I turned to my cousin to tell him about the horse, and if he had ever seen it there before, just to find him frozen with the bong and lighter in his hands, also looking right at it. He had this look of terror on his face. When I looked back towards the thing, I saw it was standing on its 2 back legs and facing right at us. Its front legs were side by side as it was trying to intimidate us or something. We were all just frozen, including the dog. She didn't make a move. I think either she was used to it or she felt safe with having us around. After almost a minute of looking at it, it seemed to shrink before our eyes, till it almost looked human-like. When I said to Jay, "Holy crap, I think that might be a skinwalker," he quickly responded by telling me to shut up and to ignore it. He almost begged me to be quiet. It went from what looked like a 10-foot tall creature thing to like 6 foot in only a few seconds. Judging by the old building only about 100 yards away from it, I know these things and what they're capable of. I'm Mexican born in California, but Mexican culture has a big part of my life. Along with its folklore and older stories of witchcraft and people who practice its deeper roots, Mexican culture is right up there next to Native American culture, if not the same. I'm scared to even mention any of this to anyone, but it's good for a cause. It's time that people know the truths and secrets of humans and unhuman things that are so oblivious to humanity. To that thing dwelling in the hills of Lake Paris, stay the hell away from our family, and hopefully I'll never have to see this thing again. Also, importance to the evergreen tree that we wrasse. The evergreen tree is known to be used by witch doctors in Mexico to keep evil and bad spirits away. Maybe not just a coincidence that there is a big-ass one in the middle of our ranch. I don't know why, but that dog would not leave my side for 2.5 weeks when I was there. Even my cousins pointed it out. Jay also told me that I'm weird, but in a good way, whatever that means.
One night when I was around 8 or so, I'd gone to bed early. I had school in the morning, you know. I slept pretty well that night, all things considered, but woke up out of a sound sleep at some point in the wee hours of the morning. I did not have an alarm clock at this point in time, so there's no telling what time it was. All I knew was that the sky was black outside my window. In any case, I woke up to the feeling of being watched. I thought it might be one of my little brothers standing by my bed, as they tend to come to me instead of my parents for comfort when they had nightmares in the middle of the night. I didn't feel any kind of threat or scared in any kind of way, but I slowly cracked my eyes to see who was there. There was nothing. I opened my eyes all the way, and only then did I notice what looked like the outline of a thin older male with glasses and a long-sleeved shirt on. The odd part was that this image was completely see-through, except for the outline of his body, glasses and clothes, which glowed in several shades of blues and greens that shimmered and shifted like the northern lights. Even though I had no knowledge of the northern lights at this stage of my life, that's the best way I can describe it. He just stood there with a soft smile on his face, about a foot away from the side of my bed, watching me. My father had been known to come in and check on us kids in the night sometimes, so I sleepily asked, "Papa?" thinking this was the case. The next thing I knew, it was morning, and Mom was waking me up to get us all ready for the bus. I asked my dad if he'd checked on us during the night, but he denied it. He listened to my story but said nothing in reply, probably chalking it up to dreams or my imagination. But I know what I saw. Years later, I brought it up again at my dad's house, and he seemed to think that it may have been the spirit of my great-great-grandfather, who'd passed away the month before I had been born. Our great-great-grandma was still around, so when I had the chance, I asked her about her husband. She described a thin, spectacled man who was sweet as could be, always with a smile on his face. She proceeded to tell me that he'd passed away from lung cancer, but had he had the chance to meet us, he would have spoiled my brothers and I rotten. Knowing this, I'm certain that's who came to visit me that night.
I grew up in a small mining town in the Pilbara region of Western Australia. When I was a kid, the town was still quite small, holding only about 3,000 people in it. To give you an idea of the area, the town is basically dry, arid brushland with desert further out. It has a dam with some other water sources nearby, but also has massive expanses with nothing much in between them. One day, my schoolmates were bragging about riding their push bikes all the way to a roadhouse in the Great Northern Highway, which sits roughly halfway between our town and the next town over. The roadhouse is about a 2 to 2.5 hour drive with the speed limit mostly set at 110 miles an hour. However, there were tons of hills along the way, and the sun in the Pilbara is blaying hot. Because of this, riding your push bike there as a 13 or 14-year-old would be virtually impossible without some serious preparation. You would likely need rest stops planned out, water brought, and some sort of transportable shade at the very least to even stand a chance of making this trip. So, when they claimed they had made this trip with nothing more than school uniforms and water from a puddle on the way, I knew they had to be lying. And so, I decided I would put their ringleader in his place. The guy was the only other guy in my school my size and was better at sports and never let me forget that. So you can imagine putting him in his place was something I wanted to do. Thinking he was full of it, I decided to challenge him in front of 20 or so kids who might as well have been his unofficial fan club at the time to do the ride again, but with me. I planned to take supplies in case he decided he wanted to give up, replicating his feat of living off the land like a true trailblazing pioneer. At this point, I thought he'd cop out and give me some sort of excuse for not doing it again. But, to my shock, he accepted the offer to do the ride with me. To my even greater surprise, he showed up in the beginning of the ride on Saturday morning with nothing more than his clothes and a water bottle, filled up only a quarter of the way. Trying to show up one another, we idiotically kicked things off at a fast pace. A half hour later, we were starting to get tired, and I was beginning to lag behind. Further down, we eventually came to a winding area of the road, at which point I lost him around a bend. Feeling absolutely buggered, I decided to stop for a rest about 10 minutes before continuing on. I pushed with all I had, and panic started setting in upon the realization that when I hit a long straightaway, there was still no sign of my friend. I became worried. He could have collapsed from dehydration or worse, a couple minutes up the road, and that thought kept me going very much. As time went on, I became too tired to ride my bike uphill and decided to walk it instead, but the road was so hot that my feet felt it through my shoes. I began to feel guilty the longer I went without finding the boy I began the ride with. What if something had happened? What if I had got him killed? After more searching, my mind had convinced me that I had gotten him killed. About a half hour later, I was coasting back when I saw a small goat track leading to a small crop of trees where I decided to take shelter from the heat. Most of the way down the track was when I saw a familiar bike. Hope rising within me, I began calling out for my rival. When I eventually found him, he was sitting up against a tree, throat too parched to make any real sound. I gave him a bottle of water, which he drank too fast and spent the next couple of minutes coughing and sputtering. We were both absolutely rooted at this point. After resting for a while, we walked our bikes back to the road where we were lucky enough to be rescued by a dude driving in a ute, a utility vehicle that is in the Australian equivalent of a pickup truck. Upon our arrival back, we went to my parents' house, while we played Sega for about 3 hours before my now friend finally headed back to his house. I collapsed at 4 in the morning and only woke at about 9 in the morning, Sunday, when my mom checked to see if I was okay and asked what was wrong. I never told my parents what happened. I lied and said we'd been building jumps at the bike track, in the bush all day all over the road. At lunch on Monday, my new friend left his mates and found me, asking me if I wanted to play Foursquare with them. His friend thought he was going to make a fool of me about the entire ride, but I just nodded and accepted his invite. That was that. We never became close friends, but after that he respected me and stopped encouraging the other guys to give me a hard time. We both eventually became part of this silly initiative the school was pushing called the School Council. He became the rec guy and I the environmental guy. We never truly forgot that day of riding, though.
I had recently been on vacation in South Dakota with my family and 2 others. In my family, there was my mom, my dad, my sister, who I'll refer to as Julia, my other sister, Gretchen, and myself. I was 15, Julia was 12, and Gretchen was 10. In the second family, there were 4 people, the parents and their 2 daughters. The last family was made up of 2 parents and their 3 kids. I woke up on one of the last days of the trip and went outside to sit on the porch of the camper cabin. My parents were up, along with Chet, Carl, and Julia. The adults were at the picnic table and talking about whatever outdoorsy people talk about. I was more of an indoors person. I had no interest in joining their conversation. I was on the outside because Gretchen was not a morning person. Julia ran over to me and said that she had to show me something. She brought me only a few feet away from where I had been sitting and pointed at the ground. What I saw made me queasy. It was a leg, half covered in furry skin, that was slowly rotting. You could see the bones poking out. Julia thought it was a pronghorn leg, but I thought it was from a coyote. We told our mom. She said that Nathan and Calvin had brought it over after finding it in the woods near their cabins. Needless to say, I was horrified. The next day, we went to Bear Country, USA, which not only has bears but several other animals as well. In one of the enclosures was a coyote. Remembering that terrifying leg, I looked at the live coyote's legs, and I was right. The leg was the back leg of a coyote. My stomach churned. Whatever had killed that coyote had severed its leg, was big, and obviously a carnivore. There must have been only one creature in the park that fit that description, either a bear or a mountain lion. The thing was, Nathan and Calvin weren't allowed to wander more than about 80 feet away from the cabins. This mountain lion or bear had been near where we were staying, and us kids often played outside in the dark. I was the oldest and the tallest. I was only 5 feet tall, but I was skinny and weak. That mountain lion or bear could have taken us down easily. It just scares me so much to this day to think that that leg could have been one of ours. It's so horrifying that I can't even imagine if that was ever the case. What makes small towns so small sometimes is how much nature surrounds it. And this time around, nature was too close for comfort. Number 5.